During the summer of 1941, the German naval offensive against the Atlantic convoys had reached a critical stage, as Allied countermeasures began to slowly arrive upon the battlefield. It was amidst this desperate landscape that a newly commissioned U-boat embarked upon its maiden voyage, a patrol that, unbeknownst to its crew, would result in only death and dishonour. The Allied powers would come perilously close to losing the Second World War on a number of key occasions, one of these being the summer of 1940. During this time, German submarines would sink 282 Allied ships, carrying up to 1.5 million tons of supplies across the Atlantic Ocean to Great Britain. This was a task completed with relative ease, as the Royal Navy had little in the way of resource or countermeasure to prevent these attacks. Buoyed by this success, Adolf Hitler ordered a dramatic expansion of his submarine fleet, more than tripling production rates. One of the many U-boats constructed at the Hamburg naval yards during this period was a Type 9 U-boat, which would go on to be designated U-501. As with many of its sister ships at the time, this submarine would put to sea the following year with an inexperienced crew, spurred on by stories of success and glory. But as they would come to learn, what their fellow submariners were now referring to as the happy time would soon be coming to an end. The man appointed to lead U-501's crew was a 35-year-old, Hugo Forster, a career naval officer who had risen up through the ranks, but never actually seen combat. With experienced U-boat staff spread thin around a rapidly expanding fleet, Forster found that the majority of his crew were in a similar situation to himself. Consequently, when his submarine sailed out of Trondheim harbour on her first war patrol on the 7th of August 1941, it was with a palpable air of tension. This only worsened as during the coming month, the submarine failed to engage any enemy targets and was attacked by patrolling Allied aircraft on a number of occasions. It was with elation, then, that the order was received on 4th of September to join a wolf pack that was being formed to attack an incoming Atlantic convoy. Named the Markgraf Group, this wolf pack consisted of 21 boats, all of which were being directed to form up off the coast of Iceland. Being 650 miles to the northeast of the planned rendezvous, Forster immediately gave orders for U-501 to break her patrol and to join the wolf pack, the intended target of which was already steaming directly into their path, an Allied convoy of 61 ships and 4 escort vessels, many of whom would not survive to make port in Great Britain. The SC convoys had been envisaged to carry bulk goods across the Atlantic Ocean from Canadian ports to the docks in Liverpool. It was believed that massing ships into larger and less regular convoys would increase the chances of a successful passage. This argument historically seems to have been borne out, in that of the 177 convoys that travelled the route during the war, only 1 in 5 were ever attacked by the enemy. The unfortunate counter-argument to this tactic was that those who were attacked typically suffered heavy losses due to a lack of effective escort vessels. When SC-42 set sail from Cape Breton Island on the 30th of August 1941, her Commodore was painfully aware of how exposed his command was. The 61 cargo ships possessed a smattering of 4-pound deck guns, operated by inexperienced crews, and 1 Sea Hurricane mounted aboard the largest of their number. In addition to these defences, the Canadian Navy had provided 1 destroyer and 3 corvettes to try and ward off marauding U-boat attacks. Every man sailing in the convoy knew this would offer little protection against a determined German commander, their worst fears being confirmed a week later when they stumbled directly into the path of the waiting U-boats. Desperate not to miss out on the developing battle, Hugo Forster pushed U-501 at her maximum surface speed of 18 knots, urging his crew to maintain momentum. The U-boat was in such a hurry, it very nearly missed out on its first victim on the morning of 5th September. The Einvik was a Norwegian merchant vessel that had been dogged with engine issues and as a consequence had fallen behind the rest of the convoy. Overjoyed at this development, Forster ordered his crew to torpedo the ship, and then stood off to allow its 23 crew members to take to their lifeboats. But his happiness quickly soured, as it became clear the torpedo damage alone was insufficient to sink the Norwegian ship. Electing not to waste any more torpedoes, Forster ordered the crew use their deck gun to finish off their victim. He then watched on in growing anger, as it took his crew a further half hour and 40 shells to finally sink the damaged ship. Trying hard to control his rage at the time and the resource that they'd spent on this kill, Forster ignored the IVIC survivors and gave orders for the submarine to carry on its journey. Listening on to the radio reports, as far ahead of him, the rest of the war pack started to engage the enemy convoy. On the morning of 9th September, several U-boats from the Markgraf group quietly managed to slip in amongst the busy lanes of convoy ships and then open fire. For the next 24 hours, 7 merchant ships and their crews were sunk, and 3 more giant transport ships left adrift and powerless. Despite standing orders not to stop to assist survivors, the Commodore made the decision to split his escorts, in the hope of salvaging some of the stragglers. It would prove a fatal error, as 2 of his escorts remained at the scene to fend off further attacks on the damaged vessels, leaving only 2 to defend the rest of the convoy. During the course of the 10th of September, 3 more convoy vessels were picked off by further U-boat attacks, the gunners in the convoy ships desperately firing at the shadowy silhouettes that cruised beneath their star shells, as their 2 remaining escorts charged back and forth on desperate depth charge runs. Luckily for the survivors, though, U-501 was not the only other ship hurtling towards them at that moment, because additional Allied forces had already been directed to offer protection to the rapidly diminishing convoy. A week after the departing ships of Convoy SC-42 had disappeared over the horizon on their journey, 2 more ships slipped anchor and departed from St. John's Harbour. Both were newly commissioned Flower-class corvettes, rushed into service by the Royal Canadian Navy to try and increase protection for Allied convoys. Christened HMCS Moosejaw and HMCS Chambly, the 2 warships were manned by completely inexperienced crews, embarking on their first deep-sea training exercise. The commander of the Moosejaw, Fred Grubb, had watched the departing convoy with interest, keenly aware it would still be within travelling distance of his exercise area. But at the same time, he was nervous at his crew's lack of prior combat, and unsure how well they would perform if the convoy were attacked. On the afternoon of 9th September, 4 days into their training and with food supplies beginning to dwindle, Grubb received the news he'd feared. Having been given orders to rush to aid the convoy, both corvettes rigged for action and made full speed across the Atlantic towards the unfolding battle. Not realising as they did so, they were now on a collision course with an equally inexperienced enemy vessel. At 9 p.m. on the evening of the 10th of September, U-501 was running at top speed on the surface when her lookout sighted fires on the horizon. Straining his ears from the conning tower, Hugo Forster detected the dull and repetitive crump of depth charge explosions off in the distance and realised his ship was now in striking distance. The U-boat captain immediately ordered the submarine down to periscope depth and made towards the fray, intent on claiming a second kill. But at that moment, 6 miles off his starboard side, ASDIC operators in the Chambly reported a submerged contact, travelling on a parallel course to themselves. Commander Prentice immediately ordered his crew to battle stations and veered across to the target, ordering a depth charge run. But right away the inexperience of his crew became evident, as one of the operators mistakenly double-loaded 2 depth charges into the launcher. The result of this act was twofold, the first issue being the launcher was damaged immediately after firing, meaning no further depth charges could be launched. But a far more beneficial outcome was a twin depth charge explosion directly above U-501, resulting in utter chaos aboard the German vessel. With the Chambly's depth charge launcher out of action, Commander Grubb now gave orders for Moosejaw to move in and take over the hunt for the mystery contact. But no sooner had his vessel changed course to support its sister ship than a German submarine suddenly erupted from the water, 400 yards off its port bow. Although the double-depth charge had done little in the way of structural damage to its hull, the immense shockwave had panicked the German crew. Beset by electrical failures and burst piping, Forster had panicked and given orders to surface, only to now find himself sat directly between two enemy warships. For the briefest of moments, as sailors began to emerge onto the bow of the stricken submarine, the captains of the three vessels stared in open shock at one another, before Forster screamed for his crew to fire up its diesels, and the submarine began to pull away from the two Canadian ships. At the exact same time, Commander Grubb yelled at his gun crews to open fire on the escaping sub, turning his ship to give them a better firing angle. Once again, the chronic lack of experience of the Canadian crews was plain to see, as the crews operating the 4-inch gun managed to jam the weapon without firing a shot. Now, as the German sub continued to pull away, a race began to see which captain would be the first to re-establish control of their panicked crews. Cursing his gunners for putting the ship's main armament out of action, Grubb ordered that Moose Jaw's searchlight be trained upon the escaping submarine. Seconds later, the bright white beam of the searchlight picked out numerous figures labouring across the bow of the retreating submarine, potentially arming its deck gun. In reality, what the American sailors were witnessing was the German crew struggling to comprehend the position they now found themselves in. Despite his ship essentially still being seaworthy, Forster was refusing to allow the crew to dive, insisting they prepare to abandon ship. But these orders were being actively queried by his executive officers, who instead were ordering the crew to prepare to fight back against the two Canadian warships. Deciding to take no chances, Grubb ordered the Moose Jaw to overhaul the sub and engage it with the vessel's heavy machine guns. But just at the point of doing so, the terrified Canadian sailors once again jammed the firing mechanism of their weapons, rendering the corvette essentially defenceless. Seething with rage, and convinced the U-boat was about to open fire on him, Grubb gave orders to ram it, and several minutes later, the Moose Jaw slammed into the side of the sub. Seemingly dogged again by farce, this collision was not as harsh as intended, as the submarine veered away again at the last second. Instead of a clean impact, Moose Jaw caused severe damage to one hydroplane, but became temporarily interlocked with the German vessel in the process. As both crews stared in horror at one another, a lone figure ran across the bow of the U-boat and leapt across to the Canadian vessel. This act prompting Grubb to fear he was being boarded and break off contact, leaving the submarine to drift away into the darkness. The German crew had now realised their ship was unable to dive as a result of the damage sustained by the collision. But aboard the Moose Jaw, and with his 4-inch now operating again, Commander Grubb was taking no chances. Midway through preparing to abandon ship, U-501 was peppered with gunfire, killing several men. As the Moose Jaw continued to fire, the Chambly now approached the U-boat, determined to try and capture it, and any intelligence documents held aboard it. But as the prize crew boarded, they were unable to detain any of the fleeing German crew, despite threats with the rifles and sidearms they brandished. Their efforts to retrieve any papers would also fail, as the submarine literally sank beneath their feet, with the Germans having opened the sea clocks as they departed. The submarine would take 11 of its own crew and one member of the boarding party with it, as the Chambly went on to rescue the remaining 35 German sailors from the water. Meanwhile, aboard the Moose Jaw, the sole German sailor who'd fled U-501 during the collision was brought before Commander Grubb, introducing himself as Captain Hugo Forster and claiming he'd done so in order to try and negotiate terms of surrender for his crew. U-501 would be the first enemy submarine to be sunk by the Royal Canadian Navy during World War II, earning the crews of the two corvettes massive accolade. Sadly for Captain Forster, his wartime record will be remembered for very different reasons, with his crew refusing to speak to him again, having deemed him a coward. Upon their subsequent arrival in England, Forster was allocated to the Kriegsmarine POW camp at Grisdale Hall, but authorities became aware that the prisoners there, including U-boat ace Otto Kretschmer, were intending to try him at an unofficial court of honour. This practice would later result in the death of the first officer of U-570, who had been ordered to break out of the camp and try and sink his captured vessel. Forster was therefore moved to alternative accommodation and actually returned to Germany in January 1945 as part of a prisoner transfer. Sadly for him, he was then detained by the German Navy on charges of cowardice and went on to die by his own hand the following month, rather than face his trial. Having sunk U-501, the two Canadian escorts were able to assist other ships in the defence of convoy SC-42, resulting in the loss of only 6 more merchantmen and 1 attacking U-boat. Over the coming years, improvements in radar technology and Allied air cover would turn the tide against the U-boat fleet, ultimately leading to victory for the Allied powers, but only at the great expense of the 100,000 sailors lost on both sides during the course of the Convoy War.